A nap folyamán többször visszanéztünk a múltba, akár az előző évre, vagy az elmúlt 25 évre, Daniel T. Jones nagy előadása viszont a következő évtizedre koncentrál.
Oh yes, very good, thank you. Okay, so you ask the customers to choose, and they choose all of them. So Szabolcs asked me to be prepared to talk extensively about all of them, so obviously I have more slides on each of them than I can use. So you have all of the slides, or you will have all of the slides, so if I miss slides, you have them in the pack, you can look at them later. So let me try and weave together a story. What we need to do next, just before I go on to what we need to go next and to talk about those 4 challenges that I think we have, let me just tell you a couple of stories. The first story is that I was invited by a former Fiat executive who'd been doing lean in tractor plants across the world. He came from Florence, and he was invited after his Fiat career to become the head of the Florence hospital system, because they were in crisis and they faced the challenge of rebuilding the oldest hospital in Europe, built in 1288, that they decided not to turn into a museum, but that they had decided to completely rebuild the inside of the hospital along lean principles. So Luigi used this opportunity to fundamentally transform the running of the hospital. I won't tell you the whole story, but basically the outcome was he broke up the 118 departments that each proud doctor used to own, and he broke them up and said, we're now going to organize around the 5 major process flows, the flows of patients through the hospital, instead. And the deal he did with the doctors, in return for taking away their power, was he gave them extra time and resource to help deepen their professional skills and do more research. So it was a good win-win deal, and the doctors were prepared, in this case, to give up their power over their little departments, which disappeared. And he not only organized the flow of work around the patient flows, he completely redesigned the buildings around those patient flows. Really impressive, dramatic story that led to him being responsible not only for one hospital in Florence, but the whole Florence system, and now for the whole of Tuscany. While I was there, which is only a few blocks from the Dome, absolutely historic Renaissance territory, he said, come with me to the cellar, to the basement. And we went to the basement, and this is the picture at the basement. And there is the slab, the stone slab, on which Leonardo da Vinci did his first dissections of human bodies, to begin to scientifically understand how the body works. And then, which is quite amazing, standing there, this is where Leonardo da Vinci at night, in secret, was dissecting human bodies. And then about 3 blocks down, there is a museum of all of the wax models of the dissected human beings that they created, because they had no way of preserving these bodies. And there's a very amazing museum of all of these wax models, very detailed wax models of the buildings, of the human beings. And upstairs is Galileo's observatory. So we're right in the middle of Renaissance history. But while I was standing in front of the slab, Leonardo's slab, it just, and I'd been struggling a lot about how to communicate lean to doctors, it just became clear to me that actually what we are doing, the fundamental thing we're trying to do is teach people to use the scientific method. To use the scientific method, the same scientific approach that doctors use to diagnose and treat medical problems, we're using the same approach to diagnose and treat organizational problems. And that's at the root of what we're trying to do. And when you talk to doctors and explain this, they say, yes, of course, why wouldn't you do that? Of course you would do that. And then you begin to ask them to look around at their processes, and you begin to reveal all of the things that would need to change if you were to seriously do this. They say, well, wait, hang on a minute. Why don't we do a quality program instead? Because that's not so disruptive. It involves a lot of maths and science and variance analysis and so on. And that's what's happened. The healthcare movement spent quite a time trying to solve their problems through quality tools and didn't have much success. The medical industry and the software industry are still the two industries that are complete outliers in terms of the quality of the services they deliver. Hundreds of thousands of people are killed unnecessarily in hospitals around the world due to medical errors. Think about that. Now the healthcare industry has been actively understanding lean. They've understood that, in fact, it isn't just standardizing the work of individual doctors, which is not standardized because they all do it the way they were originally taught. That's great if you could standardize on evidence-based best practice. But it's also not just the act that we need to standardize, but the process in which the act takes place. And so lean actually is demonstrating very significant advantages, improvements in healthcare, but also in healthcare quality. It's delivering quality improvements as well as process improvements. So healthcare, for me, has been the most frustrating industry, the most challenging industry, but the one that has revealed the most, because it is actually what I call a management-free zone. The hospital actually has never actually been scientifically managed. Each little department was the responsibility of different doctors, and they had their own resources and their own nurses, and none of them were ever trained in management. So as medical problems become more complicated, and solving them involves a lot more technology and specialists and so on, the dysfunctions of a chaotic ad hoc system become evident to the point where the next generation of doctors are really frustrated by the fact that they're being asked to work in a broken system. So it's a management-free zone, which is very interesting because there is no management to improve. We have to actually build it from scratch. So you have to figure out what management we actually need to support the front line dealing with patients. So I'm going to draw a little bit on some healthcare examples through this talk because it is the most glaring place where we can learn about management. Let me make another point, and that is we've heard a lot about the importance of focusing improvement on the front line, whether it's the engineering front line in designing products, or whether it's service delivery, or whether it's production and distribution and retailing. That's right. Without improving the front line, we are doing nothing. We are not affecting the way we create value and deliver value to customers. But it is not right to say that lean has to be done just bottom up. In my experience, that is absolutely not the case. Because there are time and time again, we've seen bottom-up experiments reach to a certain point and then be frustrated by the fact that top management is not engaged. And if top management still sees lean as an improvement tool, another one of those improvement tools for which you hire experts to go and do it for operations, so I don't have to worry about that problem anymore, and I don't have to change the way I behave and act and lead and manage, then you have a dysfunction that is not resolvable. So lean has to be top-down as well as bottom-up. And indeed, I think you find a lot of experienced lean consultants coming to the conclusion now that unless you have the attention of the CEO, unless the CEO is willing to understand this is a fundamentally different way of managing, don't start, which is sobering. But I think it's not enough to lead just bottom-up and top-down. We also have to develop the capabilities of managing across the functions. Functions are very important. Toyota is a vertically organized company like anybody else because that's the way you deploy knowledge, and that's the way you organize the development of that knowledge, and that's the way you deploy resources. But alone, it results in the pillars and the chimneys and the optimization of pieces of the system and not the whole system. So we have to build a capability of managing both the vertical and the horizontal. And Toyota does this in a very unique way, which is little understood outside Toyota. And that is they have chief engineers for each product line responsible for the success of successive generations of that product. And they are absolutely responsible for the horizontal design, engineering, and production of that vehicle and the next generation vehicle 4 years' time. They are as senior as department heads, so carry a lot of clout and responsibility in the organization, but have almost no people reporting directly to them. So the chief engineer is the voice of the process, if you like, voice of the customer. And the chief engineer, the ability for him to do what he needs to do depends upon his ability to be clear about the resources he needs from the different functions to accomplish that. So the value stream actually is the customer, as I said before, of the resources from the functions. So this is a challenge to simultaneously manage the horizontal and the vertical. And yet we need to do that because we find that lots of lean efforts that are not seen in the context of the whole and in the context of that horizontal flow, they don't last. So I think we need to manage and act at the bottom, absolutely, and at the top, and in the middle, at the same time, ideally. So this is not a blueprint. This is just a framework for understanding the 3 levels of management. The other framework we've come up with, and please don't accept this as a model, as a framework for a series of questions that we are using to evaluate the many transformations we've observed over the life of the 18 institutes and the 20 years that we've been doing this in multiple countries. In order to understand transformations, we need to be able to actually describe the elements of the transformation. And it's a very useful set of questions. First of all, is the organization clear? And this actually applies at a micro level as well as a macro level. Are we clear what the business problem is we're trying to solve by using lean? Too often, lean programs are done because chief executives or senior managers have heard about lean and want lean done in their organization because somehow it's going to result in improvements and so on that may or may not be translated into the bottom line. So being clear about the performance gaps that we're trying to close is the foundation of any PDCA process. And yet we don't typically spend enough time defining that in terms of business results, not just in terms of process outcomes. I'll talk about that in a minute. So being clear about what the problem is we're trying to solve, then recognizing that in order to improve the process, we need to develop the capabilities of the people managing the process, as I talked about, in the context and led by leaders who can define the direction we're trying to go and can mentor and support the development of those capabilities. And again, I come back to the same point I made in the first slide. It's about the purpose of lean is developing the PDCA capabilities of everybody in the organization. That is what actually differentiates over time a lean organization from an organization that is just doing fake lean. And turning process results into business results is something that lean guys and girls are not too familiar with, because we are familiar with improving processes and delivering process outcomes, better quality cost delivery. But actually, all we're doing is creating opportunities that have to be turned into business results by senior management. If we can, by improving our process, deliver, in the consumer goods industry, for instance, we can deliver every order 100% complete on time with no invoice errors. That's a big leap from what most people can deliver in the industry. And if you talk to sales and say, we can actually demonstrate we can now do this, they say, wow, I can sell that extra, I can generate extra sales on the back of that. My point is, the sales don't happen unless somebody takes action to turn the process opportunity into business results. So improving quality, improving delivery reliability, improving all of those kinds of things that touch the customer and the customer can sense and feel, that is the way we grow the business. Seeing and diagnosing the value stream, I'll talk about in just a minute. The point of that is to enable management to see where to act. Creating stable processes and flow in the value-creating work, the business result is that it frees up cash. Either reducing the order-to-cash cycle or freeing up inventories, whatever you like. So what are you going to do with that cash? And then aligning capacity with real demand as opposed to created demand, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and being able to pull and respond to real customer demand, actually you find that you don't need as much capacity because you're no longer dealing with peaks and troughs, and you reduce your unit costs. And also, you discover that you don't need so much capital expenditure for next generation equipment because you don't actually need that extra warehouse, and you probably don't need that additional production capacity. So lean is a business result. In terms of business results, it's about generating growth, it's about freeing up cash, it's about reducing unit costs, and it's also, very importantly, freeing up capital expenditure. That's the number one objective in Toyota's case, is doing everything with less capital expenditure up front. So we have to learn and be better at turning process results into business results and making sure that action takes place, and that's the responsibility of senior management, not lean folk. So, my first challenge is learning to focus. And I would ask you to remember the last strategy document from your executive team that you saw, and remember the list of projects that was on that strategy document. And I'm curious if you can remember, how long was that list? How many think their list was under 20? How many thinks it was under 50? How many thinks it was under 75? That's more like it. What about under 100? I think you're all being very diplomatic. The evidence I've seen is that pretty well every executive list I've seen is between 50, 60, 80, 100 projects. And look at that list, and a lot of them are the result of politics at headquarters. A lot of them are about spending money on new systems. I said before, that's the last thing we do, is spend money on new systems before sorting out the process. So there are thousands of things we know from the Kaizen activities. There are thousands of things the organization could do to improve. But which are the vital few performance gaps that we need to close to meet the strategic objectives of the business and to make the improvement efforts by everybody in the business really effective? It's the hardest thing to do. I've done it to myself. Jim and I have done it many times to ourselves, and we've done it in our institutes more systematically recently, is actually use Hoshin Cannery to whittle down the number of projects to under half a dozen and to deselect the rest. And that's painful. And they always creep back. It is terribly painful, yet extremely powerful to do. So we want an evidence-based method for deciding on what those vital few are. And that's one of the things that Hoshin does. We came across a hospital that was being managed like any other hospital. This was an exceptional hospital. And we asked the executive team how many projects were going on in the hospital. And they said, we don't know, but too many, lots. So we actually went round and we collected all the projects and put them up on a wall and discovered there were 515 projects ongoing in that organization. There were 350 targets being measured, presented, analyzed, and reviewed every month. And each of the divisional directors carried responsibility for about 50 of these projects. And when we looked at a time analysis of their workloads, we discovered that, in fact, their workload was about 150 to 200% of the available time. So what does that tell you? That tells you all of management time is going to be sucked up into project review meetings. And meetings to plan the projects, meetings to review the projects, meetings to discuss why we didn't achieve the results. And they're going to spend no time on the shop floor. In fact, many of them had never been really to the shop floor, really hadn't a clue how the hospital worked, which is staggering. So we said, okay, what keeps the chief executive and his team awake at night? And it's actually, in this industry, it's quite clear, because there are often government targets, and there are in the UK. There's a quality target, which is reducing hospital-acquired infections. It could be mortality rates, but quality is one. Then there are a whole bunch of access targets, which is essentially a time or delivery measure. How long does it take us to see the patient in the emergency department? How long does it take for a planned operation to take place? How long do they have to wait? 30, 60, 80 weeks? Try and get it down to 18 weeks was the target in the UK. Amazing. Then there's a time measure, which is reducing length of time, the time patients stay in the hospital. And then there's reducing costs. So it's quality cost delivery, really, or quality delivery and cost. And we said, if you could only do one of these, which one would it be? Which one would it be? If you could only do one. Did I hear? Quality. Of course. But if you just tackled quality, you'd probably be spending more money tackling quality. And you'd certainly do nothing to improve the access target or length of stay. You might improve quality. Certainly while you measured it and had people putting effort into it, but as soon as they left, the grass will grow back again. So quality isn't the right answer. Of course it's the right answer in one sense, but actually in a business sense it's the wrong answer. If you do a cross-impact analysis, which is what this diagram does, you realize that the only one of those targets that actually will impact all of the rest is time. And that, of course, is the lean insight. It's focusing on time, raises to the surface all of the other issues. The synchronization issues, the pull issues, the quality issues, the defect issues, they all have to be addressed in order to keep focusing on reducing the length of time. So that's a really big wake-up call, and it's a wake-up call for many executive teams. So you can be addressing functional objectives that may be well and good, but actually have very little business results. So addressing time is the core. And the discipline, one disciplined way of running Hoshin, and there are several. You must choose and experience the one that you like. And this is the toughest, is to actually run 4 different experiments. First of all, in the left-hand column, go through that process of agreeing the vital few performance gaps that need to be closed and whittling those down to measurable performance gaps. Then on the bottom, having another discussion about how would we measure whether we were achieving these gaps? What are the targets that we want to set? And making sure that we had targets that covered all of the objectives. And then we'd have another discussion about, from the bottom of the organization, the suggested improvement projects that we might undertake to achieve those results. And we'd have a discussion winnowing those down by also looking at whether they actually address the objectives and whether they actually, through the actions, will have a measurable benefit that we can track as we go through the project. And then on the right-hand side, this also gives us the basis for tracking progress of each of these projects over time. Now, I've oversimplified what is a difficult process. It involves a lot of negotiation. But it's an extremely good clarifying process for senior management teams. And over 2 or 3 cycles, gradually behavior begins to change. The structure of meetings changes fundamentally. We're suddenly now having stand-up meetings, particularly review meetings, where we're only discussing the reds. We don't need to discuss the greens, we discuss the reds. What is the problem? What do they propose to do about the problem? What can we as an executive team do to support that, to enable that, to escalate it, whatever, to get back on track? So this is, all we're doing here is using PDCA and visual management to manage the strategy process. So that's half of the story. It changes the way we think, it changes the way executive teams work together, and it changes the way we decide priorities. The second is, of course, we do this at different levels, and we link it down to the actual project teams, maybe the plant level Hoshin, to the organization level Hoshin. No more than 3 levels. And this is where the dialogue takes place between the projects and the resources necessary to complete those projects and the objectives. And a dialogue, a catch-ball dialogue, but to make sure that we have the resources to complete the projects to achieve the objectives. And we're only doing the work that will actually focus on achieving those objectives. So we build a Hoshin dialogue. And again, like all forms of visual management, they are the framework, the Hoshin X matrix, the A3 diagram, is the framework for a dialogue, for a plan, do, check, act, disciplined, scientific approach to making decisions. It's very, very powerful. If you're not into Hoshin yet, you will be. And you will need to get to learn how to work with your executive team. It is extremely powerful. And this is the way to create the discipline and effectiveness in management. If you go to the bottom of this slide and ask how, I've been tough on managers and tough on headquarters and called you all Muda and all the rest of it. Don't be offended. It's to provoke you to think. So how do managers use their time? How do you use your time? What fraction of the time are you actually taking decisions that will have a direct impact on the bottom line, on the front line, sorry, or on the customers, and on the customers? It's a tiny fraction. So we've already talked about the top one. If we could focus the organization on the vital few projects rather than the many other projects, we will free up a lot of management time. We don't need to work on those other projects anymore. If we manage projects in a lean way, with visual, if we break the projects down into small increments of time, and we had red, yellow tracking, just as like we have on a progress control board on the shop floor, we can see the progress very clearly, and we can focus our decisions, short stand-up meetings rather than long meetings with big PowerPoint, packs of PowerPoint, in which the bad news is hidden on slide 39. We've all done it. All those PowerPoints go out the window. and we're standing in front of the board discussing the reds. So 3-hour meetings become half-hour stand-up meetings. Effective meetings in which you're really taking decisions, unblocking, deciding on decision-ready issues. Very effective use of management time saves a huge amount of time in meetings. Third, by creating stability at the Gemba, in any of our operations, in our support operations, as well as the primary value streams, by also going and seeing and being responsive and seeing and listening to and seeing the problems, the plan versus actual, the deviations, the plans, the problem-solving activities, and so on, by going there frequently, all those emails and a lot of the firefighting goes away. And that's a large fraction of what I observe many managers are doing. They're actually conjuring, juggling fires. And yes, I understand if you've got a government that's also throwing things at you every day, that's going to necessarily involve firefighting as well. Look, I'm sure we do that in the UK as well, and Hungary's no different. So these are ways in which we free up management from unnecessary work and unnecessary time in order to spend more time in developing and coaching their subordinates. That's a very important new role that management needs to play. Every manager needs to be doing their own A3s and coaching their subordinates in their A3s and developing their problem-solving capabilities. At the moment, we don't have time. Sometimes people say we don't have time for lean because we're too busy. And the other thing we do is we free up management for what they should be doing is thinking about the future. Thinking about innovation, about next generation products, next generation services and solutions. That's the most important thing that management can do, is to provide clear direction. So there's a lot to do to improve the effectiveness of not just the top of the organization, but the alignment of all of the activities throughout the organization. That's why I think learning to focus is as important as learning to see. It's tough. We tried many years ago. Jim and I failed terribly because we can always dream up more interesting things to do than we've got time to do. Will we deselect them? No. They might get done. But gradually over time, as we've used A3s, as we've gone through this process, it really is a very, very good way of focusing on the vital few things. Do it personally. Do your own personal Hoshin. So, the next skill I wanted to show you is the skill that middle managers in particular need, and also top managers, of diagnosing your flows. And again, I want to take the hospital example because it's a very nice example where it's clear. If you go to any organization, in particular a hospital, they'll tell you that every patient's different, that demand is completely unpredictable, and so it's all the chaos that we experience is all the fault of the customer. None of that is true. There are 635 medical conditions in the English health system. 6% of those conditions account for 50% of the work. The bulk of the work in healthcare is a few very standard types of problems. And many of the others, in fact, follow very similar process steps. So why don't we work on those rather than the very complex cases, which we can deal with later? So actually, demand is not only very similar, it's also extremely predictable. These are admissions into an emergency department, and then some of the patients, of course, need to be admitted into the hospital. And what you see there, if you're a Six Sigma person, is you do not see any special cause variation at all. It's all common cause variation. It's predictable. We ought to be able to plan our capacity to meet it. We know it's coming. And if you look at daily and weekly and seasonal patterns, they are extraordinarily predictable. It is not true that customer demand is stable and unpredictable. It is true in every industry. We may interrupt that demand and contaminate it through promotions and discounts and all the rest of it. So the purchase and ordering decisions might be a bit more erratic, but most demand is actually flat. So what we experience further upstream is actually chaos that is self-created. Is entirely the way we manage the way information is managed particularly. And you can see this in the supply chain back upstream, the classic Forrester effect. You can see it in the hospital. What is the cause of variation in workload in the hospital? Well, go and look at the staff car park on Sundays. It's empty. Do people not get ill on Sundays? We effectively have been running a 7-day demand in a 5-day system. So what does that do? On Monday, there's a huge peak of demand, and the work comes down on Wednesday, and it's okay. And then there's another big peak because Thursday we've got to work hard to get people ready for the weekend when nothing happens. So level demand we've turned into peaks and troughs and chaos. Budget cycles are another cause of variation in demand. Holiday allocations. Doctors all like going skiing at the time when, in fact, they need to be in the hospital. And a peak demand for doctors. And actually, the scheduling of holidays causes additional chaos and rebooking of patients and elective procedures and so on and so forth. My point here is not the hospital, is not the chaos that is created by the way we manage demand in the hospital. It happens in every industry. So can you understand and track, it's the first thing you should do, the difference between what Toyota call real demand, which is the real demand of the customers, and what people experience in terms of the work they're asked to perform, the created demand created by the system. You know it in the banking industry. It's the calls people ring up to say, where is why didn't you, all of the things that are basically unnecessary calls because somewhere your process is broken. So you see it very evidently. They shouldn't happen. You should eliminate the root causes, dramatically reduce the number of calls. A problem if you're being paid by the call. So understanding the difference between created and real demand is the responsibility of management. Happens in the planning department, of course. The curse of batch planning systems is another cause. But it's up to senior management actually to address those causes because we are giving chaotic work to the front line that we are hoping will develop stability in the way they perform the work. How can they do that if we're throwing unpredictable demand at them? It's quid pro quo. So very important and neglected and in most cases not done. The second then is to take a big picture view of the flows through your organization. I don't mean tracking an individual flow just yet, we'll come to that. Nobody in the healthcare system would draw this, so I drew it on the back of an envelope and they said, yeah, that's probably about right. They told me there are 630 different conditions, and I said, well, if I took the roof off the hospital and was flying with a drone watching what was going on and the flow of patients, I bet you I'd only see 2 or 3 flows, and there you are. There's a flow of patients that come through the doctor for tests and so on and go home again, the outpatients. There's another flow of patients for whom, yes, they need a treatment or a procedure or whatever, and maybe even to go into a bed and recover. So that's the planned patients. And then you have the biggest flow of all, of course, which is the unplanned patients, the emergency patients. You can't turn that demand off, it's coming at you all the time. So there are 3 flows. There's an outpatient flow, which is about clinics. There's an inpatient planned flow, and there's an unplanned flow. And you can map the location of all the quality problems in that system, and that's a very good thing to do. You can also track the queues. And that led us, as we were told, all the problems at the front end. They're the queues at the beginning of the system, in the emergency department, for the X-ray machine, for the operating theaters, for clinics, etc. So lots of lean projects in each of those departments. Deep frustration with the results, even though they were very good, because all it was doing was hurrying patients to wait in the next queue. Until we went to the back end of the system and looked at the patients in the beds and said, how many of these patients are ready to go? And you go and look at any hospital, it's between 25 and 35% of patients are actually ready to go but are still occupying a bed. It's not visible, you can't see it. But if you collect the data, all they're doing is they're either waiting for a place in a rehab unit, or they're waiting for a lift home, or the test results haven't come back and they're waiting for the doctor to come around next day, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And discharge is not managed. It sort of happens at the end of the day when people are queuing up waiting to try and get in. My point here is that if we act in any other part of the system without acting at the back end of this system, it's a waste of time. Unless we manage discharge and manage the flow of patients getting out of the system and align it with the flow of patients coming in to free up the beds, then actually lean efforts elsewhere are not going to make any difference. So we've got to learn to find the place where we can unlock the flows. It's not always at the back end. It's sometimes at the front end. It can be in all kinds of places. But until you actually put the map of the processes, at high-level processes on a wall, and begin to see the flows, you won't see it. Because you won't ask the right questions. Now, I've done this also with a big container shipping company. We took senior executives. We walked the process first. Ideally, we would have taken the executives with us to walk the process, but they were too busy. So we got them in a room, and with a few experts, we mapped the whole process of selling container space, taking an order, booking shipping, the actual shipping process, et cetera, et cetera. And what was interesting about that, there were 5 different places in that system which were causing noise and extra unnecessary work elsewhere in the system. Once we saw the system, we could see the places where if we took actions, it would have enormous savings elsewhere in the system. So I think this is extremely important for organizations to do, to really be able to diagnose where their processes are broken and where they can, where to act. And then when you do, then of course you go into deeper mapping, and I'm sure your processes are no different to a hospital process. This is why you don't want to go to hospital. The one thing about the hospital process is that solving the primary patient flow, each of the interventions in the patient to take them to the next step, is not enough. In this case, we depend so heavily on lots of support services that synchronizing those support services with the tact of patient demand is extremely important to make the process flow. So we can reduce length of stay by 30%, we can make the work visible, as I'll show you in a second, and we can synchronize the process flow by making the work visual. By putting progress control boards in each ward, plan for every patient, see plan versus actual, teams decide the steps that are going to happen to the patient, are expected to happen to the patient until they go. For every patient, it's very clear. And suddenly the work is clear, whether the work's been carried out is also clear, problems become clear, managing the ward becomes much easier, etc. So it's a classic visual management of work that you all are familiar with. In this case, every 2 hours we collect information on the patients that are nearly ready to go onto a hospital board where the status of every bed is captured. And we can then begin to plan discharge work and unblock the activities that are needed to make sure that we level the discharge task and we're discharging as many patients as are coming in. So that's a visual hospital board, a way of managing the flow. And we can see the number of therapies and tests and so on that are required from each of the wards, and we can aggregate those, and that becomes the demand on the support functions. So here we're building a visual management system for a hospital that you have in many industrial operations, but is completely absent in healthcare. So, kind of interesting. This is, maybe I'll skip this example, except you can read about this in the back of Seeing the Whole. This is an actual example from GKN, actually, of an automotive component where we tracked all of the subcomponents that go into that component they deliver to a car maker. And we discover it comes from China, Japan, Brazil, Mexico, UK, Germany, Spain, all the parts from all over the world. And the total lead time, something like up to 90 weeks, between 25 and 90 weeks. So it actually travels more in being made than actually it will travel in use, which is kind of interesting to think about. And for the next generation product, of course, this exercise was done so that for the next generation product, they could design a completely different production system that was no longer based upon low-cost labor and focused factories. And the lead time of this co-located production system is 24 weeks. 24 days. So this is what I mean by big picture mapping and redesigning. It's equivalent, actually, to redesigning your facility as well. So instead of automating the facility first, let's redesign the facility. I'll come back to that at the end. So let me just say a word about building capabilities and then about customers. This is the area that I am sure you are most experienced and familiar with. So in a sense, this is a checklist to make sure that you are aware of all of the pieces of this story. Toyota taught us that the right sequence to do lean is first to stabilize the work, and then to flow, to link what we can, and then to pull where we can't, and then to use Junker boards to level the work. And that's fine in an environment in which the work content is fairly stable and predictable, and the mix is fairly consistent. In most other sectors, we have to start by identifying and separating out the high volume from the complex. In transaction processing, instead of transaction processing all the complex processes as well as the simple tasks, take the complex out of the line, streamline the simple processes, and you free up time to deal with the complex processes. It's the same in many other sectors. We need to sieve first. We need to recognize what we can begin to flow in order to free up time to flow the rest. So it's what we call sieving. And then we can flow. Then we can link things together and see the disconnects. Then we can begin to flow. And then we can begin to stabilize. And then go through the Toyota sequence. And we do that by, as you know, by visual management, by making plan versus actual visible, by problem solving, by developing problem solving and Kaizen capability and teamwork. But that only happens if we develop standard work for managers. And I hope that wherever you are doing this, you are developing the capability for standardizing the work of line managers and support and group leaders and plant managers, who have two tasks, both to enable the work, to manage the visual management, to respond to it, and so on, but also to develop the capabilities of the staff. And that's why our objective is daily Kaizen. 5-day Kaizen blitzes every 6 months is not going to change anything. It's fun, but in between, nothing happens. In fact, things go backwards. So the real objective is to get everybody involved in Kaizen every day, going through as many PDCA cycles as possible so it becomes habit. And we do that by, as managers, by going and seeing, as Fujio Cho said, managing by asking why rather than telling people what to do, which is hard, but we need to learn how to do it, and respecting people by challenging them and enabling them to grow. And I'm sure you're aware of the TWI job instruction, job relations work is foundational. It was the foundation of Taiichi Ohno's teaching methods right at the beginning and right throughout. You're familiar with A3 analysis, I would hope. How many people are using A3s here? Yes, a good number of people. It changes the way you think, and it changes the way you work. It really is foundational. And it's the tool at first that every manager is given on entering Toyota. They're given a problem, they're given us a mentor, and they have to learn the process of using the scientific method to gathering the data and solving the problem. And you've come across Toyota Kata, which is, again, building routines to develop their standardized behavior. Those are the elements that comprise Toyota's approach to developing people before making products, which is a phrase that we heard many years ago and never fully understood. So interesting. I'm not really going to talk about A3s. What I find about A3s is really the fun of A3s is being able to go and read people's A3s. And you can tell at a glance not only the problem they were tackling and whether they've done a good job in defining the target condition, analyzing the current state, root cause analysis, and whether they've come up with interesting countermeasures, etc. But it teaches you how they think. It's clear and evident. And in my view, the way to judge a person's capability is not by going on a certification course or judging how many courses they've been on or how many Kaizens they've been on. It's actually looking at their portfolio of A3s, just like a pilot's flight log. Look at the portfolio of A3s, tells me everything about the nature of the problems they've tackled, how they've tackled them, what tools they've had experience of using, etc., etc. It tells me everything I need to know. So A3s are really the language for management. Let me just end with 2 slides. In parallel to the traditional lean movement, there's a very interesting development that's happened in the French Institute started a Lean IT Summit in Paris 4 years ago to start bringing the software community together. The Agile, Scrum, Extreme Processing guys and the big IT systems guys and so on, who are all struggling with the limitations of such point improvement tools and looking to Lean as a way forward. And we really have developed a way of understanding and describing Lean project management for software engineering now. At the same time, you've seen Eric Ries's book on the Lean Startup Movement, which has captured an enormous amount of excitement in the young in the young startup world, in the digital world. A great use of the same logic to improve the effectiveness and the survival rate, if you like, and the success rate of startups. But it's only a small piece of the story. Every business started as a startup. It's being able to scale, to manage at scale those successful technological innovations that is really key, and that's where Lean has a lot to contribute. So I've been thinking a lot about what are the key insights that Lean can offer to the digital age, and how do we inspire and communicate Lean to a different generation. And I'm still struggling and thinking about that, and we'll have something to say about that in the future. Meanwhile, of the books I've read, the most significant that I think you should read is not The Digital Age, or even Lean Startup, but is that big data book. If you understand the capabilities that are opened up by being able to analyze vast data sources, complete data sets, and being able to distinguish patterns in there that we can never see before, and to be able to track things we'd never tracked before, to be able to see what people intend to do while they're searching for, as Google does, to track what they actually do, and to be able to predict what they will do next. It gives us real-time information on what is actually happening in complex situations before we understand the causality of why these things are happening. It allows us to act in fundamentally different ways than small data, which is what we've been using for analyzing small samples and cause and effect. It adds a whole new dimension, both to our analysis tools, but also to our communication tools and the ability to connect with customers. It's a foundation. Really challenging. We need to get our heads around it. It will affect every single one of you. Let me end with one interesting story which mirrors your story of building the Lego plant. We've spent a lot of time in every industry leaning our existing operations. And that was extremely important, but it's just the first step. What we learn in doing that is a tremendous amount of experience, in addition to what the experts learn about the technical possibilities. It adds a wealth of information on which to base completely different new designs for next generation. I don't just mean next generation supply chain like the example I had before. I was in Saskatchewan, Canada in September last year, looking for an example, a Canadian example for a big healthcare talk I was giving in Toronto in October. And I came across the Saskatchewan government that is now performing a huge lean program right across the public sector, in education, in social services, in policing, and in healthcare. Really impressive. It's a very small province, only 1 million people. But this is a terrific example of spreading lean across government. And one of the things they've done is actually use lean to help design new hospitals. And what they've done, they have a warehouse, big warehouse, I've been to the warehouse, and they invited 3 different teams of patients and frontline staff to come together and map the flows through the hospital and design together an ideal flow for the hospital. And then as a second part of the exercise in the right hand and the left-hand picture, then to design model rooms for the 3 different types of rooms that are typical and needed in the hospital. Actually mock them up with paper and cardboard and all the rest of it. The architects and the builders were at the back of the room, not allowed to say anything. So it was the users that came up with surprisingly similar outcomes and plans. And you can see one plan of part of the hospital. Minimizing the flows, minimizing the distances, all of the kind of things that you did in the Lego factory. Really interesting. But this was just patients and frontline providers. Over a 5-day 3P exercise. And then it was given over to the architects and the builders to develop not only the detailed plans, but the process for building the building in partnership with the suppliers. And visiting the building next door as it was being put up, I was absolutely struck by how small the building was for the number of beds. So the capital cost of that building is much, much less than building a traditional hospital. More importantly, the running costs over the 40-year life of the hospital are about 60-70% of the previous of existing hospitals. And it not only minimizes the flows and minimizes the waits and the queues, it's a much better environment for people to work in. And they've been part of it. The community's been part of it. So I think there is tremendous opportunities for us engaging with our customers in all sorts of different ways, electronically, in a community, with sample customers and so on, to co-design delivery systems, products, and so on for the future. And that's where the real gain from lean lies. And combining that with the capabilities of the digital revolution is going to create many, many, many new opportunities. So that's why I like that example. There are some great videos of that 3P process if you go on the Saskatchewan healthcare website. So that's kind of what I wanted to say. I'm going to skip these other ones. And let me just end with this. if you had to look at the challenges the lean movement needs to address in the future, this is my list of yesterday or last week. It'll change. But we need to start thinking big time about how we meet growing healthcare costs of an aging population in a tax revenue that's never going to increase. How do we renew our infrastructure with a tax revenue that's not going to increase? How do we make things and learn how to make things without relying on cheap labor? And that doesn't just apply here, it applies in a developing country too. How do the Chinese learn to build things that don't also depend on cheap labor? How do we create value and more fulfilling work? How do we create vibrant and sustainable communities? I think there's enormous potential in the digital revolution there for decentralized communities. So there's a tremendous amount, and look, it's exciting. It's a really, really exciting time for your generation to take lean into a next phase. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to watch you do it. But it's probably one of the most exciting times. So don't just look down at lean in your own workplace, which is important, and with your team, but also be thinking, what are the societal consequences of doing lean? How can we make a better world using lean? Lots of potential. We just started. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
On time.
Yes,
absolutely
you were exactly
on time.
Prompt. Thank you. Hölgyeim és uraim, van még körülbelül fél óránk a kérdések-válaszok részre, úgyhogy várjuk szeretettel a kérdéseket. A hostessek pedig odaszaladnak a mikrofonnal. De amíg gondolkodnak, nekem van egy. I've got one until they are thinking.
Okay,
if you don't mind.
No, go on.
And this is something that has come up a number of times in small talks, in conversation during the break.
Yeah.
And that has to do with the regionality or locality of, certain specifics, very individualistic situations. Lean always sounds so universal to me, but does it take into account these local characteristics? And regional characteristics and individual characteristics?
That's a very interesting question. Let me answer it this way. If you go around Toyota, which we imagine is all the same, fantastic system and all the rest of it, the first thing you're struck by is how different every plant is. Very different. They have come up with very different local answers to local situations. So the plants look very differently and operate very differently. The principles that they're using behind that to design that are absolutely the same. So it's the principles and the thought process that is behind this that is common. Every situation is different. And so we need to not look to copy others or apply copybook solutions. We need to really deeply understand what we need to do right here, right now, with the people we've got to solve the problem that we have, and come up with a local solution based upon the thought process and the principles behind it. So it's the principles that are common. The solutions must be different. And that's the creative thing, is going around, boy, you see, they came up with that solution, I could use some of those over here, and so on. So there's a tremendous opportunity for learning across functions. So I do think that diversity is part of the lean story, even though it's maybe a surprise.
It is, but
so
it
I'm
sounds
sure there are Hungarian solutions. I'm sure things that you did in your plant are different to what they would have done if they built the plant in Denmark or in Shanghai or wherever. It would be different because the situation is different. That's a very good question. Yes.
Most probably behind the solution there is a hell lot of knowledge.
Yes.
How they can share the knowledge?
Well, you share.
On the best way.
No, well,
Many
ways. Many ways of sharing the knowledge. I think an early part of a lean transformation, particularly a multinational transformation, is allowing local experiments and actually deliberately conducting experiments of doing things in different ways. We've done that, for instance, a big supply chain project in big multinationals. We've deliberately let different pieces of the SIF from different countries try different things. And then we've evaluated what works and what doesn't. We've brought those people together. We've created a community of practice that can learn from those experiments and then decide what fits best for local situations next time round. So I think communities of practice are a very effective way of building a community of knowledge and sharing that knowledge and creating a bit of peer pressure. That's also good. So I think that's the way, because actually what we're talking about is not, as I said, it's not thinking, it's practice. It's what people have learnt to do as a result of that thinking that we're sharing. And so going and seeing and sharing stories is extremely powerful.
I've got some conflicting ideas that I've heard, and that's been disturbing or troubling me for some while. During today's presentation, multiple times you referred to simple tools. The Swedish IT company with no computer screens but paper, or you mentioned A3 with a paper and pencil and things like this, which I personally believe. And later on today afternoon, you mentioned big data and large amount of data collection. So when I want personal engagement, people involvement, Genji Gembutsu, I'm trying to kill IT systems and not implementing systems to collect data. And corporate is in love with this, global corporate IT tools.
And corporate is going to be in love with the idea that connecting everything is going to answer all the problems. Yeah. It's bullshit. It won't work. Absolutely right.
So how do you resolve this conflict that you've got big data expectations and you try to focus a lot on that? I didn't read the book yet, but
I thought that book would be simply a PR case for doing everything everywhere. And it actually isn't. It actually does talk about what big data can do and can't do. It's actually more balanced. And it's a much better book than I expected. So do read it. They're an additional set of tools that we can use to connect with customers and connect with suppliers in ways we couldn't in the past. But again, they're not a substitute for face-to-face collaboration. And they're not a substitute for automating broken processes, which we typically try and do, which is a disaster. How many of you are struggling with SAP systems? Yep. We've seen there's a very good example in Denmark where they've actually leaned the processes first and used Lean to introduce SAP, and it's been extremely effective. So I don't believe, I'm with you in your heart that IT is death and is going to kill all Lean and so on. It's not true. We've got to learn to use both things. And I think the more we understand about the digital world, us old folk even, the more we can actually use our wisdom in how it gets applied. And caution and be wise in using it, because there are tremendous potential, I think, in big data. But don't be deluded that this is another snake oil salesman trick. It isn't. It's a real set of new additional capabilities that we didn't have before. It's a very good question. I mean, I meet that all the time. Lean guys just bristle. But I've learned from talking to the software guys, who come with this whole mindset, and yet struggle with working together and working with their customers, and are looking for Lean to help build a framework to enable them to see how to do that. Otherwise, they just retreat. They just try and carve out a space with which they can do their creative software design. There is a really good book on a software company in Michigan. It's a project development company called Joy Inc., Richard Sheridan. which describes a real lean software development company. It's a fantastic book. Can't recommend it enough. Go and read it, Joy Inc. So that gives you a real sense of how lean and digital can actually collaborate together. But I've learned that you have to really get into that space and understand it to be able to understand how to do it. You know.
További kérdések? Bocsánat, nem láttam.
Dr. Jones, we are talking about lean in every kind of areas like hospitals and schools and etc. I know it's a little bit silly question, but do you think lean will have ever an impact on society somehow? This scientific way of thinking, PDCA, will change our life in private life also?
If we start teaching PDCA in primary school, you laugh. I'm serious. And there are schools in Holland beginning to do that, and you just heard that example here today. You know, what are the skills our children actually need in the next generation? And PDCA and problem solving and team building and creativity and so on, and communications are exactly the things you heard. So I think there is a realization that there are a different set of skills that our children will need to have, and we need to find different ways of learning for the digital generation. They learn in a completely different way through games and so on. You heard really, really great story about the school. So I think it's generational. And I think the lean school movement, lean education movement, Jim and I have always said that university is the last place to change. Having been a university professor, I can tell you that's true. And universities are 10 years behind practice in lean. Schools, maybe, I think there are some innovative schools, and I don't know enough about that side of the movement, but I'm sure that that's going to happen, that we're going to see changes in curriculum, changes in the way people learn. And that is going to fundamentally grow up through society and change society, yes. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question here.
Universities cling to the idea that theoretical knowledge somehow gets implemented. Right? And because lean is so simple, you know, it's not complicated. So what is there to study? And the only place you can study and learn lean is by doing it. And they don't want to do that. So, you know, universities have a big, big challenge. We need to bring them in, we need to infect them, we need to get placements for academics to change their mind and so on. We need to change the incentive systems in the universities, etc. But the world of experts is changing, and they're not very useful experts. But things will change. A bit of competitive pressure in higher education will make that happen.
There is a question.
My question is a little bit similar. How often can you meet politicians, and how often can you convince them to use these principles? Because that would be very necessary. I'm not only the Western Hemisphere, the Eastern one.
Yeah. No. Look, I do meet politicians. I've had a long. I've sat on various government task forces and so on in the past, and the dream that you can convince politicians to implement this is a dream. Because the only things politicians can do is they can change the playing field by changing the laws and so on, and they can throw money at things. But that's all they can do. And now they don't have the money, so, you know, they're struggling. But I have deliberately now, for instance, in healthcare, now I've been told many times, why don't you teach the NHS centrally and then they can make sure it happens right across the country? Well, that is not how lean works. And doesn't work. We tried it. And what you get is experts going out to hospitals telling them to do things they don't really understand or want to do. I'm from headquarters here to help you. You know, it's that kind of syndrome. And it doesn't work. What works is building lots of islands of experiments that shame other people into doing it, if you like. It needs an open society. No, that's true. Absolutely, yes. Yes, it does. Yes, no, I agree. And that's whether Lean can create an open society, that's another very different issue. You're right. Open societies will create innovation and creativity and so on and grow. Closed societies is a problem. I read why governments fail, why states fail. A very interesting book I read just recently. I don't know if you've read it, but yeah. So, openness, creativity. Politicians can create the space for that if they really are wise, but generally they're a nuisance. And you probably have more experience than I do of this.
There's a question in the back. Go ahead.
The question in the back is the missing capability of analyzing big data. How you say this regarding to Six Sigma and other analysis tools and softwares? What's missing? What's the essential?
What's missing is the fundamentally different approach. They are expert-driven solutions that depend upon experts analyzing and telling people what the answers are. They don't engage people and educate people in learning how to solve their own problems. And they're also point solutions. They're not at variance with Lean. You need a lot of the Six Sigma techniques on the shop floor to analyze variance in your process, but you don't need a certificate and a black belt in order to do so. Because that expert mindset that I hire experts and train them and they're black belts, all that does is, and the rest of the organization say, well, I don't have to bother solve these problems, I get the experts to solve it. Throw it to the experts. And that's why Six Sigma's run into the sand. It's also a point solution, it's not a system solution. So it's a piece of the story, but it's only a piece of the story. And there's no accident that GE turned around and said, Six Sigma's not enough. We have to do Lean as well. And when that happened, that legitimized CEO interest in Lean. And that was a good thing, but it led to McKinsey going around saying, ooh, there are lots of wonderful Lean programs I can sell. And if the executives still think of it as McKinsey doing it for them, McKinsey will take the money, they'll go, and nothing will happen when they leave. But if you hire McKinsey or any other consultant, and you actively are involved and actively suck the knowledge and experience out of them and build the knowledge inside, then you've got a good chance. So don't get me wrong, I have good friends in McKinsey, they're great guys, but if you're stupid enough to hire them to tell you what the answer is, they'll take your money. Good for them. I love them dearly. But remember that the only thing that sticks is what you do yourself. Nobody can do this for you or to people. You have to do it with people. They have to grow and learn. That's why learning is the foundation of this. PDCA and learning. That's what it's all about. Which is why it's so interesting, because it will go in different ways in different places.
Earlier today in the ladies' room, there was some complaint that there are a lot more men here today than women. Mm-hmm. So how is the gender issue for Lean?
Good question. If this were a healthcare conference, there would be about 3/4 women and 1/4 men. And that's actually very interesting and very different. So I think it depends on the industry. I do think that we should all be showcasing more women on these conferences who have great stories to tell. We had one here today. I think this just reflects a reflection of society. I don't think that lean is particularly at fault here. I think it's just, if you go into the auto industry conferences are full of blokes. And it's not as interesting as healthcare conferences. So I don't have an answer for that, but.
My question would be regarding to the measurement. So what would you measure in the progress of Lean? Would you measure it, and how would you measure it? If you want to measure the success of Lean implementation and also achieving the business objectives.
Yeah, there are two sets of things I'd measure. One are the process outcomes, the quality cost delivery of whatever process you're talking about. By how much are you reducing defects? By how much are you reducing time? By how much are you saving capital expenditure and so on? So there are process measures, but there are also business results measures. And in your Hoshin process, you should be defining the performance gaps that you need to close. Again, there will be in quality, cost, and time, actually. So there are business results that you should think the process improvements are going to contribute towards. But as I said before, it doesn't just happen. Action has to be taken to achieve those results.
Thank you.
But not the 350 targets. So defining the critical few, vital few KPIs is part of that Hoshin process. Absolutely.
További kérdések?
Well, I just wish you the best of luck in Hungary. We've all got different problems to face. I'm not completely familiar with the Hungarian problems. I learned a little bit about the political situation in Hungary. But, yeah, it's encouraging that there are so many people at a conference like this, and this conference is growing, and that's tremendous because this is an infection. It's a good infection. And the more we can spread this infection and the more we can demonstrate and share stories, the better. So thank you for inviting me, and best of luck.
Mr. Jones, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Especially on your big day. We do know that it is your birthday today.
Yes, before you leave.
And we wanted to wish you a happy birthday.
Oh, thank you.
Shall we sing?
In the name of the Hungarian community, let me wish you a happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
This is a worldwide known Hungarian wine called Tokaj.
You realize that I've got a problem.
Yes, drinking problem.
No. I can't get this on the airplane.
You don't have a.
I don't. Fine. That sounds good. This was supposed to be a secret, but thank you.
Or we will send it to you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, now I'm familiar with Hungarian wine. You do export wine, which is a good thing. So thank you.
Happy birthday.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.